really neat dream.
What's that?
I dreamed I saw Gorgeous hitchhiking.
Oh.
And he turned around and stuck his thumb out, and I hit him. I sent that puppy flying over my car, and I stopped, and I went back. He was still alive.
So you backed over it?
No, I let him know exactly who I was, and I broke his neck.
This is the biggest case that we had ever had in Alaska.
It seized the imagination of the community and the fears of the community.
You don't have that happen up here.
People were scared, and they had a right to be. Friendship has its limits. I'd say murder is a limit.
She's a very dark and bitter individual.
You don't know who you're killing. You don't even know who you're killing.
There were devils walking on this earth. There were actually devils.
They thought this was the end. They hoped it was the end. It was just the beginning.
An explosion has rocked Thunderbird Falls this afternoon. The roof of the house collapsed. Witnesses described it sounding like an earthquake. The explosion rocked this quiet neighborhood shortly after 3:30. Neighbors say they didn't know what hit them.
In September of 1991, I was the district attorney in Anchorage. I remember very vividly when we heard that there had been an explosion in Chugiak. It's in the outskirts of Anchorage, more or less a suburb becoming rural. It's an area where you don't expect bad things to be happening. When first responders arrived, the debris was terrible. It was a wreck of a house.
It was September 17th, 1991. I was a member of the Chugiak Volunteer Fire and Rescue Department. We were dispatched to this house in Thunderbird Falls for a report of an explosion. And we didn't really have much more information than that. I arrived on the first engine, and I recall when we pulled up, it was pretty chaotic. You could look and see that the windows were all blown out, and the front wall was actually separated from the rest of the house. We were all kind of going under the assumption that it was some type of gas explosion. Nobody anticipated the type of call that we were actually responding to.
In 1991, I was a reporter and anchor for the local NBC affiliate in Anchorage. Thunderbird Falls is about 20 miles north of Anchorage. It's one of those close-knit, everyone knows each other, small communities. This was a big story.
The neighbors, had trouble believing that an incident like this would have happened in their community. It was hard to imagine that anyone could survive inside. One of our primary concerns was, is there going to be a secondary blast due to utilities being disrupted?
Explosions were not very common back then when I was covering news. And so having any type of an explosion in a neighborhood was a big deal, and we knew something big was going on.
We made entry into the structure. We have to go in and search and make sure that we locate everybody.
Is there anyone alive?
It was a female resident of the house. She came out and went immediately to the ambulance.
She was grievously injured, suffered catastrophic damage to her face and her body. Her body was literally shredded with shrapnel from the explosion.
She stated that she felt like she was melting, that it pushed her down towards the floor, and she laid there until the medics came in and extracted her from the scene.
It affected her hearing, it affected her eyesight, and she was in a state of semi-consciousness.
Michelle, you're okay, Michelle.
Fortunately, the first responders had a tape recorder, and they were able to talk with her, and Michelle, although drifting in and out of consciousness, was able to give them key information. Information within the first hour after the explosion.
We were informed that there was another potential patient involved with this incident. And so we searched the house and make sure that we locate everybody. We located the male victim. It was apparent that he had passed away. It was clear when we found him that he was, at the center or near the center of whatever explosion had occurred. I've been involved in fire service for quite a while, seen a lot of things, been to a lot of scenes that, I don't care to recall. This was my first explosion ever, So yeah, maybe a once-in-a-career type of response.
There were a lot of questions, and everyone was just eager to find out anything they could about how this all happened.
The cause of the explosion remains unclear.
Why did this happen? Who did this? And should we expect more of the same? Is this going to occur again?
When there's a major explosion in a neighborhood like that, you're not thinking to yourself, this is related to something that happened a year or so ago. I never could have imagined what was coming our way.
A lot of people think of Alaska as just a great big wilderness. To a certain extent, it is.
In the early 1990s, there was a real spike in violent crime. There's a lot of firearms amongst the 500,000 people who live in Alaska. It was getting a bit out of hand. The murder rate was going up. Drugs were part of that. So Alaska was very anxious about crime. The DA's office and the Anchorage Police Department had been struggling to deal with it, and the community was very concerned about it.
My husband, Ron, was in the Army. In 1964, they sent him to Alaska, and the family came on up here. We had $3 in our name, a flat tire. But, in those days, we didn't know any better. So we just did what we're supposed to do. It is what it is. That's the new thing. It is what it is. 6 years after coming to Alaska, I had my third child, and that was Jeffrey, and he was born in 1970. Jeffrey was 6 years younger than Brian, 8 years younger than Colleen, so he was the baby.
Jeffrey Kane, by all accounts, was a really wonderful young man with a bright future, beloved by his family, really admired by his classmates from high school.
He loved sports. He played soccer. In the summer, he played hockey in the winter. He was a pretty smart boy and had a good sense of humor. He was probably the best of the three kids going to school.
After Jeffrey graduated from Chugiak High School in 1988, he would go to some classes at UAA, not a whole bunch. In August 1990, Jeffrey got his dream job working as a computer analyst and programmer out at Fort Richardson. And he was planning his life. He was so happy he was going to buy a house. In fact, he was supposed to close on the house the Monday after he was 20 years old. Just Friday night, Jeffrey was going to go out with his friend Robbie, but he didn't have a lot of money, so he said, I'll be home by 9:30 because this is my last night that I can go out. I'm moving in my house on Monday and I can't afford to go out anymore, so this will be my last night. And I said, you need any money? And he said, no. He said, oh, okay. And then Ron said, behave. And Jeffrey said, I love you. And I said, okay. Be home early. Yeah, I'll be home by 9:30. So he off he went.
So when the red Toyota was Robbie Chamberlain, Jeffrey Kane's best friend, the two of them were heading out for a burger.
But they never made it to the restaurant.
There's a Kentucky Fried Chicken just off an exit ramp in the Glen Highway on the way into Anchorage, Alaska. A young man suddenly ran into a restaurant screaming for help. He said that something terrible had happened to his friend.
He was driving along the highway, and the next minute he looks over, and his friend's been shot.
This is 100 Muldoon Road. It's just off the Glen Highway, which is over there to the north. This was a Kentucky Fried Chicken. We were very busy that night, and I was downtown Anchorage, and I got dispatched to here at the Kentucky Fried Chicken. So I was coming up the Glen Highway, and I swung into here, and as I got out of my car, a young man, white male adult, approached me. He was very, very upset and said that his friend had been shot. And so I looked in the passenger side, and certainly there was a white male adult, mid-20s or so, who was deceased. I immediately called my dispatch, asked for extra units to secure the area, and I wasn't sure if the shooter was still around. I didn't know what was happening until we got him calmed down enough to let us know that it happened out on the highway. We had a shooter that we didn't know where they were. We didn't know who they were, and we didn't know if there was a potential for them to strike again. One of the things that we had to ascertain was it random? Was it targeted? We didn't know at the time that this incident would be the catalyst for a very complicated case that would go on for years. I don't think anybody really saw coming what manifested itself in the end.
The usually quiet surroundings of this Muldoon neighborhood were shattered this evening as gunfire rang out on the highway. So far, there's no news on injuries, and people are wondering if there's a gunman on the loose.
I went downstairs about 9:15. The phone rang, and I answered the phone. It was Robbie.
Oh, I just need a minute.
Miss Kane. I said, what, Robbie? Miss Kane, come now. Jeffrey's been shot. I said, what? Jeffrey's been shot. I said, where you at? Kentucky Fried Chicken, Muldoon. I said, okay. I said, Ron, we gotta go. He said, what? And I told him so. We left. Down the Glen Highway we went.
We saw the police lights on several cars and stuff, and so we kind of figured that's where the shooting happened, but we didn't know how critical or how serious it was.
The policemen wouldn't let us in. So they put Ron and I in the car. And we couldn't get out of the car. The doors are locked. So Ron is like an animal trying to pound and get out of that car. So finally they let us out.
One of the policemen came and said, you can't go up this road, it's blocked off because of the homicide. And when he used that word, that's when I knew.
That was how we found out Jeffrey had died. So I'm sorry, I
was kind of numb. Probably didn't show much emotion because I had no wife with me.
There is nothing in this world can prepare you for losing a child. It's like they just left. When is he coming home? You know, the what ifs, and I could go crazy thinking about that. Why didn't I tell him stay home? Why didn't I say you're moving, you need to pack? Why didn't I do this?
Another officer came down, I guess he was the captain, and he said, we don't really know what happened. And it seemed to be a drive-by incident. And I don't want you to get your hopes up too high because we haven't had this happen before. So it's a likelihood that we won't ever find out. How am I going to live the rest of my life knowing I don't know who did it, see? And that was probably the hard part. Knowing that my son was killed, but I would never find out who did it or why or anything like that.
On the morning of October 20th, the news broke all over Alaska and all over Anchorage, in the papers and in the television, and everyone was horrified and terrified by this crime.
It was a pretty big deal and kind of scary, not knowing what was going on, who had done it, was there a shooter out there? The young man is dead, and everyone is kind of wondering, how did this happen? Was this random? Did they know each other?
The idea that someone could be driving down the road and suddenly shot, assassinated effectively by a sniper-like killing was terrifying to the whole community. No one knew why it had occurred. There appeared to be no backstory, no altercation, no drug deal. There was a real fear. Parents were afraid for their children, worried that some terrible menace was out there that in theory could strike anyone.
We had an unknown suspect or suspects, which raises the intensity of trying to find out exactly what was going on. We went across the highway and started to search for shell casings, anything we could find that might be pertinent to this particular crime. You just want to find out if anybody is still out there with a propensity to shoot at other vehicles, maybe.
There is always a fear, both in law enforcement and amongst many in the community, that this might be the beginning of some terrible spree.
What's in here? Well, here's something good. Jeffrey on his prom.
Mm-hmm. All dressed up with a new date.
Yeah. Nice looking couple, too.
This is the last picture that Jeff had, taken the night before he died. He needed a haircut, but it was a good picture of the last picture of his life on Earth. Miss him walking in the house. Hello, I'm home. Okay.
Got clothes to wash, Mom?
Yes.
The first thing you do is you try and figure out who wanted Jeffrey Kane dead. The answer is no one whatsoever. So without any motive, trying to identify who amongst the 500,000 people who live in Alaska might have been the shooter was almost impossible.
I've always been safe in Alaska until October 19th, 1990. That night, I just didn't know what was going on. Jeffrey was not a bad kid, so why would somebody do that to him?
We knew that a young man who had relatively no notoriety, was just a young kid doing his life, just seemed to be a regular young man who was driving in a car and got shot and killed.
There were no surveillance cameras in those days. There were no cell phones, so there was no way to track who had been in that area at that time. All we had was a murder victim and an exploded rear window.
What is the public to think? They see the headline in the newspaper, the television coverage. Was this, in fact, just a random shooting on the Glen Highway? Or is something else afoot?
Just 24 hours after the shooting, and law enforcement was baffled.
They had effectively little or no evidence about who had committed this crime. When a young man came in and said that he had been a passenger in the car that did the shooting.
Following the fatal shooting of 20-year-old Jeffrey Kane on a highway in Alaska, a witness has come forward with the identity of the shooter.
He knew about what had happened in the shooter's car.
He told the police that he had been sitting in the backseat of the car when the shooting took place.
When somebody came forward to help solve the case, I felt so grateful. I didn't care about that person's background, or as long as they weren't involved in it.
I wanted whoever did this to Jeffrey to be caught and prosecuted and put away and find out why. Why did they shoot at Jeffrey? Why Robbie's car? What happened?
He said that his name was George Kerr.
Where specifically do you live? Did Eagle River Chief accident? And how old are you? Are you attending classes then? Yes.
He was scared, but he was also doing the right thing.
George said that the car was being driven by his friend, Raymond Sheely.
And the passenger in the front seat and the man holding the rifle was Doug Gustafson.
This was not the first time police had heard these names. They were familiar with law enforcement. They had been involved in some other activities.
As it turned out, it was pure happenstance that they were all on the road at the same time that night.
George Kerr was part of Raymond Sheely's posse. Sheely was the leader, and Doug Gustafson had fallen under his sway. They were both young men who were involved in a lot of different trouble.
They were both in their late teens, perhaps 20.
Sheely and Gustafson attended high school at the same time as Jeffrey, but they didn't know each other at the time. Jeffrey knew of them, but he didn't know them personally.
These boys had interesting nicknames. Raymond Sheely was known as Smiley. He seemed to always have that grin, or some would say smirk, on his face. Douglas Gustafson came to be known as Lizard. Lizard, why Lizard? Well, a kind of a devious creature.
One of the teachers at high school described Raymond Sheely and Doug Gustafson as gun nuts. Doug, in particular, had a fascination with firearms and high-powered rifles. The Anchorage Police Department had evidence that there had been a robbery at a meat market, that these three had been participants in that robbery, and they obtained nearly $20,000. They bought high-powered weapons with the proceeds of that robbery. Before they got on the highway that day, they were using those very weapons for so-called target practice at Eklutna,
which is less than an hour north of where Jeffrey Kane had been shot. The story that George Kerr told the police was that on the night of October 19th, 1990, there were two vehicles going down the Glen Highway.
One was a red Toyota that included as its passenger Jeffrey Kane, and the other was a vehicle owned by Doug Gustafson, who was riding in the passenger seat, driven by Raymond Sheely, and in the back seat was George Kerr, three guys.
How would you describe the attitude of all of you that evening? General party attitude. Be more specific. Just in a good mood, ready to get drunk. Have fun. At what point during the trip did this little red car approach? Just somewhere before the Moulton exit, maybe a mile or two back.
The two cars had been riding in sequence with one another, and the driver, Raymond Sheely, felt that the red Toyota, driven by Robbie Chamberlain, would cut him off, and that he, Raymond Sheely, and Doug Gustafson were going to get those guys.
Of course, they had no idea who was in the other car. As far as they knew, they were strangers.
What did he say about the red car? Something in reference to, hey, these guys are screwing with us, they're trying to run us off the road or something like that. What else did he say? Was there any communication between the occupants of the red car and those two in the suits? No. Any gestures exchanged? No. Anything thrown from one vehicle to the other? No.
They gave chase. Sheely accelerated 75 or 80 miles an hour to catch up to him.
Was he trying to catch up to the red car? Yes. There was a conversation before that about shooting at the car. What was said about shooting at the car? They're going to shoot at the car and try to blow out the tires or something.
Douglas Gustafson has an HK-91 rifle seated with him. Raymond Sheely maneuvers his car and says, shoot it.
Was Doug getting excited about it? With, or he, in response to Doug saying, I'm going to shoot at the car, what did RB say?
Yeah, let's show them. Let's get him.
Let's get him?
Something in that fashion.
They changed lanes in order to give Doug Gustafson the best possible angle to get off a shot.
And they rolled their window down and they were trying to get in line for a good shot.
Where was the HK91 in the car?
It was in the front seat.
And at what point did you realize that Mr. Gustafson was serious about shooting at the car?
Not until he pulled the trigger. He was getting ready, rolled down the window and all that. And I didn't know if he was really going to do it or not. And the shot was fired.
Douglas fired one shot. It went through the rear window, directly into the head of Jeffrey Kane, killing him instantly.
Were you concerned for the safety of the people in the red car when Doug said he was going to shoot at the car?
Yeah.
And you testified that you discouraged talk of shooting after Doug said his intent to shoot the car.
Yes. You know, that's not a good idea. It's dangerous.
And you remember the comment that Mr. Gustafson made after shooting at the car?
He said, I missed.
I missed.
I was looking at the car too, and I didn't see the car stop. It just kept going, and I simply the bullet didn't hit the car too. So it's the same reason Doug did.
They didn't know that in the passenger seat of the car they shot, they had killed Jeffrey Kane.
The car in front of them continues on the off-ramp out of sight.
I'm not sure anyone in the shooter's car realized they had killed someone. It was a one shot from two moving vehicles. That was really a very rare shot.
Doug Gustafson knew what he tried to do, and Raymond Sheely knew what he tried to do, but the confirmation of what they had hit, who they had hit, and that it had resulted in a death, none of them knew until the next day.
So George goes home from the party, and early the next morning gets the news that Douglas Gustafson's shot was one shot too many. Jeffrey Kane was killed.
George Kerr told us that he had already received a call that same day from Gustafson and Sheely, warning him that in the aftermath of learning that someone had died, that the weapon was going to be hidden and everyone needed to keep their mouth shut.
George Kerr was in the back seat and really had nothing to do with driving the car or firing the gun. He was innocent at that point, right? He didn't calculate the killing. He didn't try to make these guys do what they wanted to do or what they ultimately did.
George then is in a bit of a quandary. George goes to work that morning, and by sheer happenstance, he tells his boss what happened. And he tells George Kerr, you need to go to the police right now. Whether George saw the light or felt the heat, who can say? It's fair to say it was a difficult thing for George to do, considering his background with those guys in high school and the friendship they had continued after high school. But friendship has its limits. I'd say murder is a limit. That's a line George wasn't willing to cross.
George Kerr volunteered to wear a wire and to talk to his cohort, Doug Gustafson, at his job at Anchorage Airport about what had happened that night. The police know that they might get one chance and only one chance for George Kerr to get some kind of admission from Doug Gustafson.
It's been 2 days since Jeffrey Kane's murder, and one of the passengers in the shooter's car has come forward to confess what he knows.
George Kerr volunteered to wear a wire and to talk to his cohort, Doug Gustafson, about what had happened that night. Time was of the essence.
George then contacts Doug Gustafson and arranges a meeting with Doug at the Anchorage Airport where Doug worked.
I think it's always risky if you're going to wear a wire with somebody who's already committed a homicide.
In every case like this, there is the possibility that someone gets cold feet, that the witness decides, I can't go through with this. If George pulls out, the possibility of having sufficient evidence was very remote.
Without that, the police never would have had a case. George Kerr was a linchpin of this case.
In the police car on the way to Anchorage Airport, George told Assistant DA Steve Branchflower that he had been involved in the meat market robbery a few days earlier.
A trio, George Kerr, Raymond Shealy, and Doug Gustafson, used proceeds of that theft to purchase weapons. Doug purchases the HK-91, that is the murder weapon that fires the shot that kills Jeffrey Cain.
The assistant district attorney decided that it was in the government's interest to grant George immunity for the burglary and theft, rather than risk delaying or losing a recorded meeting between George and Doug.
30 years on, only a part of that recording is audible.
October 21st, 1990, time is approximately 01:27 hours. International Airport. This will be tape number 2 on the wire.
George got to the airport. It's a highly dynamic landscape. There's lots of factors that law enforcement can't necessarily control for. It must have been a very frightening moment for George Kerr. Gustafson had a number of firearms, was a dangerous man, had killed someone in the days before.
At that point, George was the only person who could send them down. He was now a target.
Once George Kerr walked into that airport, other than the fact that the police could monitor the wire that he was wearing, he was on his own.
I think it took a lot of courage for him to do that.
George went inside to talk to Doug Gustafson. Assistant District Attorney Steve Branchflower and an Anchorage police officer were listening to the recording in real time.
George Kerr met with Doug Gustafson. That was definitely a pivotal moment.
Bad news, man. Huh? Bad news. They called my house. I called my dad and told him that I was on my way home.
The conversation at the Anchorage airport that day was chilling, matter of fact, and straightforward. They were talking about someone who had been killed only the night before.
So what are you going to do about that guy? You cannot find him. I don't know, dude. I think you should get that guy as soon as possible. Yeah.
The two young men spoke for a time, and then, moment of truth, George Kerr asked Doug Gustafson, "Why did you kill that guy?" And Doug answered, "I didn't mean to."
So what do you want to do?
At the moment someone says, "I didn't mean to kill that man," only the shooter could say those words. You had a semi-confessional statement recorded from the actual shooter, and then you had the testimony of George Kerr about what Raymond Shealy had done to make the kill shot possible. That was enough information to bring charges.
When the phone call came, they were going to arrest somebody, it was such a relief because I wanted to know who, what, when, and how. I wanted the answers.
And just a few days after the highway shooting, Doug Gustafson and Raymond Shealy are arrested and charged with Jeffrey Cain's murder.
District attorney called me, Branchflower, and he said, I think we got him. Big load off my shoulders. Just really a big load. Jeffrey was killed on October 19th, 1990. The trials came up in the spring of 1991.
There were two separate trials. Gustafson was tried first, Shealy was tried next.
The trial was incredibly tough on Jeffrey Cain's family.
Raymond Shealy was a pompous little person during his trial. He thought he was going to get away with everything.
Shealy always had the smirk on his face, kind of grinning and smiling. He wouldn't look at us. There was never any apologies. There didn't ever seem to be any remorse.
Listening to how they took aim and how they were shooting, it was just overwhelming. It was very hard to look at them, look at Gusterson and think, oh, that boy shot my son. He would never look at me, never looked at me, never.
What they did to my son, they didn't have any business walking this earth.
They were devils. So they were just devils. It's like, what is it? Walking in this earth. They were actually devils. In my mind, all three of these boys had the opportunity to stop something, stop the shooting. Why didn't George Kerr grab the gun? Why didn't he stop Sheely? Why didn't he scream? He could have prevented the shooting from happening.
As Gustafson and Sheely head to prison, George Kerr leaves the state to join the U.S. Navy.
For everyone involved in this case, they thought this was the end. They hoped it was the end. It was just the beginning.
Seven months after Jeffrey's death, our third grandson was born, a new life after a tragedy, and he was named after Jeffrey. Naming a baby after someone like Jeffrey was a living memory, like a memorial for our family that we'll always remember Jeff.
Doug Gustafson was tried and convicted in the spring of 1991. Shortly thereafter, Raymond Sheely, both were sentenced, Gustafson to 65 years, Sheely to 60, and were serving the first year of their sentence in Alaska. As far as we in law enforcement thought, it was the last we'd ever hear of these guys. But in the fall of 1991, the shock waves of their criminality were only beginning to be felt.
We used to have a police scanner in the newsroom, and so we were always listening to the radio chatter. And I do remember hearing, I think they said an explosion in Thunderbird Falls. An explosion in a neighborhood was a big deal. You're thinking to yourself, there's probably not going to be any survivors. When we interviewed the neighbors in that small community, of course they were shocked. We had a big news story on our hands.
It was scary because I'm not sure of noises like that, and I didn't know what it meant. Didn't know what might have happened.
I just heard a loud explosion and it rocked her house, and then a couple minutes later, my 5-year-old had looked out the window and saw some smoke, so I called the fire department.
You don't have that happen in a neighborhood like this. You have that happen in New York or L.A. But in a small, we have, 98 homes up here. You don't have that happen up here.
This case had a devastating impact on the entire community, far beyond the immediate family.
When first responders arrived, the debris was terrible. It was a wreck of a house, very problematic environment. Of course, there was a fear that there might be secondary explosions, and it took a while to identify who was in the house, how many people were in the house, and who they were. The first responders explored the interior of the exploded house. They found a barely alive and grievously wounded Michelle Kerr and her husband, David Kerr, who was found dead on arrival.
Michelle, you're okay, Michelle, all right?
They had no idea whether she would survive or not at that point.
The medics are literally shouting at her because her hearing is almost completely gone to elicit a response, any response, should she not survive.
Police officers here, and I'd like you to tell them the story that you told me earlier about how you believe the explosion happened again, okay?
Yeah, listening to the tape of her interview and her statement to the officer is chilling. She's trying to explain to the officer what had happened.
Stop to keep your hands down.
She was able to tell them that the bomb arrived by mail, that her husband had picked it up at the post office, and it went off whenever he tried to open it.
How big was the package? I'm going to have to scream at her. From the explosion, she's not hearing very well. relay through me and all you.
How big? Maybe.
Michelle, can you describe the dimensions, how big the package was and what it looked like, please? Were you opening the package when it blew up, Michelle?
And it was only at that moment that there was any information or evidence that it had been a package as opposed to any other kind of explosion.
Mail bombs are extremely rare. And considering that in 1991, the Postal Service delivered 181 billion pieces of mail, the only mail bombing we had that year was in Anchorage.
A mail bombing is a federal crime. Now we had the feds involved, and this was a big story.
The Postal Inspection Service is the oldest federal law enforcement agency in the United States. We investigate a wide range of crimes dealing with the mail. Those crimes can range from child pornography to mail theft, narcotics going through the mail, and murders. It was always a concern from the very beginning that Michelle might not survive.
They're at the Kerr residence. We set up an evidence tent for recovery of evidence that we had at the site. We also built these screening devices where we could go through all of the residue that was recovered from the house and the grounds. As with any bombing incident, it's very onerous to go through all of the debris and try to recover any pieces of evidence that might be in there. Debris from the front of the house extended out probably 40, 50 feet. We had thousands of pieces of potential evidence, but we have to go through each and every piece of it to ensure that it's not something that was contained within the bomb. At that point, we did not know what type of explosive was used, whether it was a military or a commercially available explosive. The bomb was virtually gone. It was exploded. We did find a tiny piece of plastic that had been a component of one of the switches. Our lab tech was able to identify the manufacturer and the switch that was used in the device. Also found some fragments that were indicative of a 9-volt battery cap or caps. That was pretty much all that was left of the bomb.
Now, this was a homemade device. It was sophisticated enough that it functioned as intended.
The homemade nature of the explosive device determined that it was very personal, and so therefore we had to determine who bore that much animosity.
Who would want to send a bomb to the Kerr household?
The pressure was to determine if this, in fact, was an isolated incident or if another package was on the way. And that was the key point that the press kept harping on. Are you sure this is it? Could there be others? People were scared, and they had a right to be. That was the challenge, is to calm the fear. We'd heard reports that children seeing a letter carrier on the street would run the other way. There was a killer out there in the community, and we didn't know who he or she was.
We live in a country where famously we had the Unabomber, who was not discovered till very late in the game. Bombs sent randomly to all different parts of the country, killing people who didn't connect with one another.
One of the most important things you can do in a situation like this is manage fear. That's law enforcement's goal, so rumors don't spread.
It seized the imagination of the community and the fears of the community and the anxieties of the community
as journalists, we're hungry for information. So the police called a press conference. We were all there.
We quickly put out a reward for information leading to the identification of persons responsible. It was a $10,000 reward. We also immediately put up a hotline to receive any information from the public.
Following the incident, there was a lot of people calling in with tips and information about who they thought could have been involved in this type of an activity, and everyone had to be tracked down and investigated.
Michelle was the sole surviving witness. Therefore, it was critical to get any information possible. At that point, we have a tremendous break.
I'd like you to tell them the story that you told me earlier about how you believe the explosion happened again, okay?
Listening to that conversation, it's gut-wrenching. She's struggling to breathe, it's obvious. She's getting out these statements as best she could. She's doing her level best to survive long enough to make sure that law enforcement understands what happened.
Okay, just open your mouth and we'll clean it out, hon.
Open your mouth for me.
Michelle was conscious enough to give that key information. The package came through the mail. It was from the state of Alaska. It was addressed to George. The first question is, why is this 20-year-old a target?
After we determined that the parcel was addressed to George, and we started trying to determine who his friends and associates were and what their relationship was, anyone that might have any animosity towards George Dahl.
And then she said those critical words.
What do you think happened? Go ahead.
Doug did it. George put him in jail.
How do you know that it was from Doug, Michelle?
So we have Doug Gustafson. Well, who is Doug, and why did he make George Kerr his target? He was in his early 20s. At that particular time, he had moved out of state, preparing to join the Navy.
We discovered that in February and March of 1991, that George Kerr had testified against Doug Gustafson and Raymond Sheely in a murder trial. And subsequently, Raymond and Doug were both convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. They really bore a lot of animosity to George and blamed him for their being in jail. It was a very aha moment.
Gustafson and Sheely, who had been convicted on the testimony of George Kerr, were the ones who would be most interested in something bad happening to him or his family. At the same time, both of these are convicted killers who are inside Alaska's most secure penitentiary.
It was a big question. How does somebody who's in prison for murder manufacture or help orchestrate the manufacture of a bomb? That was a big question, and we were eager to find out, how is this even possible? So one of the things we learned was that when Sheely and Gustafson were in prison together, they would go to the chapel, and that was how they communicated. They had some way of talking in code when they were in chapel, otherwise they were separated.
An informant mentioned that he saw them exchange notes and have brief conversations.
You're always looking for that key piece of evidence that would tie the investigation together, and the information we'd gotten from the former inmates that were incarcerated with Raymond Sheely indicated that he was very on board with whatever it would take to get revenge on George.
But we have a fundamental problem. How can Doug Gustafson and Raymond Sheely put together a bomb, get it in the United States postal system, when they had been sitting in a Alaska state penitentiary and going to be sitting there for the next 60+ years? So we looked deeper into the history of the family that was targeted. There were several potential suspects, given George's background, that might have had a motive. We had learned that George had been involved in a burglary the previous year. George Kerr, Raymond Shealy, and Doug Gustafson broke into a meat market and stole $25,000 from the safe.
And seemingly George had gotten away with it, and no charges were ever brought against him. We had to consider that the owner of that establishment might bear some animosity towards George and might try to blame George for his loss, try to exact revenge.
That lead had to be run. It was to include a polygraph, and we were able to rule him out of the investigation. We learned that George had been granted immunity for testifying in Jeffrey Kane's murder trial the year before. It's possible that the family of the murder victim would not be happy that George got away without being charged.
I felt like all three of them were responsible. The driver and all three of them, including the boy in the back seat. Why didn't George Kerr grab the gun? Why didn't he stop Shealy? He could have prevented the shooting from happening. As far as I'm concerned, he's as guilty as the rest of them. Just what I feel in my heart.
The father of the victim, Ronald Kane, was a military man with experience in military explosives. He clearly had the expertise and motive to harm George.
And then the postal authorities came to me and said, we want to give you a lie detector test. And I said, for what? I didn't do anything. He says, well, you know something about explosives. I said, I don't know anything about explosives. They said, well, we checked your military records, and at one time you were in the combat engineers, and your job was to blow up bridges and stuff.
I was very upset. Why do they think my husband and my son would do a bomb? I knew my family was innocent.
Right after I took the lie detector test, I said, what are your findings? And they said, you're innocent. And I said, well, I told you that in the beginning.
This is the biggest case that we had ever had in Alaska. Anchorage is a small office as far as postal inspectors go, and so we needed resources, and we were able to obtain the assistance of inspectors assigned all over the lower 48 states. They were dispatched to come to Alaska and assist us on the investigation. We had over 100 personnel involved. The investigation kept coming back to Doug Gustafson and Raymond Shealy.
We had learned that Raymond Shealy and Doug Gustafson had a checkered history as far as using explosives to test on blowing stuff up.
We had gotten a lot of information from people that were incarcerated at different times with Raymond or with Doug, telling us that Raymond had a list of people that he was going to get even with. Through the interviews, we disclosed that Raymond Shealy had given one of the inmates catalogs on how to prepare bombs and how to order materials for building improvised explosive devices. That was when we served the search warrants on Doug's cell and Raymond Shealy's cell. In Doug's cell, we didn't find anything of any relevance, but in Raymond's cell, we found his hit list of people that he wanted to get even with, responsible for him being in jail.
At the top of that list, near George Kerr, were Assistant District Attorney Steve Branchflower and Judge Souter, who had presided over the trial of Doug Gustafson.
The case was fairly complex. You know, suspicion was not something that we could use. We needed something that was concrete, some definite facts that we could utilize.
It was clear to us that Doug Gustafson and Raymond Shealy didn't build the bomb in prison and send it. He had help. Our hunch was the help was coming from outside the prison. We just needed to know who.
Who are their close associates? How about their family? Are they capable of doing something of this nature?
Raymond was from a working class family. These were The father worked in the petroleum industry and the mother ran a store. Raymond was their only son. Doug came from a conservative religious family that had lived in the Eagle River Anchorage area for a number of years.
We found that Doug Gustafson has a sister and a brother, Craig and Peggy. That Raymond Cheeley has another friend of his by the name of Joe Ryan that is almost like a brother, runs around with Raymond occasionally. We started looking at any possible communications between them and Raymond Cheeley, as well as Doug Gustafson.
It is hard to kind of fathom how you would get involved with a family member who's already in prison for murder.
We felt that Doug and Raymond had to be communicating with someone. If they were involved, there would be some evidence that one of them communicated to someone. No matter how innocuous it would give us a lead, at least a place to look.
We started to look at Doug Gustafson's siblings. Older sister Peggy Gustafson Barnett. She's a dental hygienist, more or less the mother figure to Doug.
Doug was the baby of the family. We found that his sister Peggy continued to see Doug very frequently with contact visits while he was in Anchorage, and then on telephone visits in Seward at the maximum security facility. Raymond Cheeley also had communications with Peggy, which is highly unusual. The fact that they were all in communication indicated that they were all working on the same thing or towards the same goal, to eliminate George Kerr.
Fortunately for us, we learned that it was routine for conversations to be recorded by the prison.
You know, the number of inmates in the prison where Doug was made it almost impossible to listen in to all the conversations that would have been made on the telephones.
We obtained the audio tapes from the Spring Creek Correctional Facility covering that time frame from September the 3rd on to the date of the explosion and beyond. There were hours and hours on the tapes that we received, mindless conversations that Doug would have with his sister, Peggy Gustafson Barnett, and with his parents and with others.
It was quite boring listening to the calls. A lot of the information was just had no relevance to the investigation at all. It was merely small talk and routine communications.
Hey, how you doing?
All right. Nobody was home over there.
No, they're in Haines.
Haines, both of them?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I put her on a plane this morning.
Why?
Oh, she just needed to get out for a couple days.
So they won't be here tomorrow?
No. I'm going to come Sunday. We're all coming Sunday.
Whatever.
At first listening to those tapes, none seemed to be focused on the building of the bomb. We determined that there was a gap in what we were getting from the prison as far as the audio tapes from what the telephone record showed, and we simply persisted with the prison officials, look for more tapes, look for more calls. There had to be more conversations. It paid off. There were more tapes. There were more conversations. And that was the smoking gun. Peggy was of the belief that Doug really was innocent, and she would do anything to help him out. And he didn't deserve to be in prison.
Peggy had played a significant role in raising Doug. There is one theory that I've heard law enforcement express, that the relationship was almost mother-son rather than sister-brother. So when you shift to that paradigm and think about what wouldn't a mother do to help their child in any circumstance, and it's a relatively small list of what a mother wouldn't do. The idea that it would be a suburban mother was about as unlikely as any notion you could have.
Last time operator.
7444. Name's Doug.
To the untrained ear, those conversations appear innocuous, boring. But when you're looking and listening for evidence concerning a bomb investigation, certain key words come out.
I'm so glad you called.
Why?
What really triggered it was she was saying, I burnt up 2 batteries.
Can you talk?
Yeah?
Okay, I burned up 2 batteries.
What do you mean?
Huh?
Oh, 2 little batteries?
Yeah, I fried them puppies.
How'd you do that?
I can't figure out what I did wrong. I got the light bulb to go on and the batteries get hotter and I burned them up.
How did you hook them up? Did you hook them parallel or series or what?
That's what I'm going to ask you.
Peggy starts some of these conversations about the problems she's having with her car. They thought they were being clever. What would appear initially to be a boring conversation between Doug and Peggy about, child care or whatever, turned into talking about a circuit or a wire burning up or a light bulb going off at the wrong time. And then they would catch themselves and say, wait a minute, now we're talking about a car repair, right?
You're,
Not right yet.
Yeah, no, this is to fix your car, remember? Okay. Okay.
Doug apparently specifically got sloppy, and he let way too much slip. And Peggy on the other side did the same thing.
Their way of communicating was highly suspicious. He says, now remember, this has to do with the light in your car. She's the what? He says, this has to do with the light in your car. You're trying to fix your light in your car. She said, okay. To us, it indicated that there's a lot more to it than just wiring up her car. This type of incident had to take some knowledge of how to assemble a device of this type, some electronics knowledge on how to get a sufficient charge of electricity to activate a blasting cap. It's something that had to have been planned out and a lot of effort put into it.
This was a multiple-step enterprise. It wasn't just like Doug called his sister and said, hey, sis, can you build a bomb? This was multiple visits to the prison by Peggy to talk to her brother. A lot of deviousness and just sort of the evil of wanting to go and kill this other person when you're already in prison for murder. And when you think about that, it kind of boggles your mind.
The crime lab determined that the chemical in the explosives is a Tovex, which is a commercial explosives, normally used for mining and road building. So that was another investigative lead. We definitely were just looking for a clue and something to give us a direction, who we could look at on the outside. We never imagined that we would find out the information that we did from those tapes. But as we delved into it deeper, we found that there were communications between not only Raymond Cheeley and Doug Gustafson, but also between Raymond Cheeley and Peggy Gustafson.
We then received information concerning Joe Ryan from the recorded telephone conversations. He was part of the group that Cheeley and Gustafson had run around with from high school, a pal, a friend. From the recorded telephone conversations, Joe Ryan is referred to as Toy Man because he worked in the toy department of a large store in Anchorage.
Well, I went by the toy section yesterday.
Why?
For a friend. And he had something for me, but not on him. And I went by there again today, and he wasn't there.
You can't assume that there's going to be extra time.
The main thing is making everything functional.
The best thing right now, though, is to get the toy man at the toys.
We discovered that a year prior to the bomb going off, there had been a theft of industrial explosives. It turned out Doug and Raymond had been involved in the theft of that explosive material. So now we have a connection between that material stolen the previous year and the material used in the bomb itself. There was a whole year between the time the explosives were stolen and the bomb going off. The link was Joe Ryan.
The local bomb squad assembled a device as close as they could to the amount of explosives that were in the subject device. I built a wooden shed to demonstrate what would happen whenever a bomb of that nature went off.
3, 2, 1, go!
We use that just to demonstrate the devastation created by that type of an explosive.
3, 2, 1, go!
Despite the damning evidence that we had, we needed more to bring it to the point that we could arrest these people.
During one of the conversations, Peggy explained to Doug that she had had a dream.
I had a really neat dream.
What's that?
I dreamed I was on my way out to see Chelsea, and I saw Gorgeous hitchhiking.
Oh,
And he turned around and stuck his thumb out, and I looked around, and I didn't see anybody, and I hit him. I sent that puppy flying out of my car, and I looked, and he moved, and I stopped, and I went back. He was still alive.
So you backed over it?
No, I let him know exactly who I was, and then I broke his neck.
I hope you took the car to the car wash afterwards. That's one thing people always mess up when they hit and run. They don't take it to a car wash right away.
She was in her car and George was on foot, and she ran over George and then backed up over him to make sure that he was not going anywhere. That indicates to me that she's a very dark and bitter individual, that she would even entertain an idea like that.
And then we had a breakthrough. One conversation on September the 5th, 12 days before the explosion, stuck out. Peggy's having a conversation with Doug about a switch. She can't get it to work right.
I had both the switches, but the only switch that it's working with is the off-on, not the lever. The lever's not doing anything. Do I have it hooked up wrong?
It sounds like I'm going to have to do a little more instructing, and I can't do that here.
Now, this would appear to be rather brazen behavior by Doug. He's in prison. He's under the total control of the prison. And he mentions to Peggy on more than one occasion, even kind of bragging about it, oh, they may be listening to these calls.
So, that's a problem.
Figured out. I know exactly which is on and which is off.
Okay. Did you mark it or something?
Yeah.
Put fingernail polish or something?
Yeah, I trashed one of the switches and I went down and bought heavy-duty one.
They were talking about a device of some other sort, some improvised device. He's trying to tell her how to wire up the bomb.
At this point, investigators suspect that Doug's sister Peggy must have been involved. But the dates don't line up.
When we looked at Peggy, there was a problem because Peggy was in the hospital giving birth to her second child at the time that the bomb went off. That indicated to us that there had to be another person involved.
Well, maybe you do have to go for brains for help.
Because, I mean, I have done everything I can think of.
Well, for brains, they'll have to help you, evidently. He'll have to tell you what to do.
They specifically discuss bringing their brother, Craig, directly into this case. And Doug specifically tells Peggy, you're going to have to get his cooperation. He can do it.
Craig was the middle child and was a little bit wild, I guess, and was running with his own crowd and wasn't quite as close to the rest of the family. Craig was a mechanic and had knowledge as far as electric circuits go.
Even though Craig was the middle child, people said that he was dominated by both Peggy and Doug.
Well, you have to talk to for brains. Make sure things are kept real quiet. Make sure he fixes things to make them work right. And
got everything.
Yeah.
It was hard to believe that the whole family would get on board with something of this nature.
Get new supplies of everything and make sure that way he gets some fresh material so it ain't damaged or anything. And have him fix it out, show you how it works, maybe hook it up all for you. So all you have to do is put it in place and glue it. And go. Or have him build the dumb thing. It's the least he can do.
It was rather unbelievable after all we'd gone through that we are really listening to the smoking guns. We've got Doug Gustafson, we've got his sister Peggy, and now we have their brother Craig Gustafson involved in this plot. We realize we have a troika, we have a family affair.
You're always looking for that key piece of evidence that would tie the investigation together. This seemed to be it for this investigation. Then we could really focus our attention on those people that are close to Doug, as well as those that are close to Raymond.
We then unleashed every tool we had in our toolkit, and that included search warrants, it included electronic surveillance.
We had over 100 personnel involved in those searches. We were more looking for anything that would have a relevance to the investigation, wiring of the same color, or wires of the same color, batteries of the same type that might have some relevance, fragments of tape that recovered from the device, if we could find anything that was matched that, and purchase receipts for switches, batteries, bulbs, things of that nature. We found evidence where some of the old abandoned vehicles appeared to have been blown up. Some damage to those vehicles would indicate it may be by explosions. The searches disclosed very little in the way of evidence. However, they did have an intended effect on Craig. Acted like he was getting very nervous.
Late at night, we get a call from a guy who wants to talk to us right away. That guy is Craig Gustafson. March 11, 1992. It's 6 months after the bombing. We get a call from Craig Gustafson. He wants to talk to us immediately. He realizes that he is a direct target. He realizes that his girlfriend is potentially a direct target because he's told her too much about his participation, and he wants to protect her. We interview him that night.
Craig told us that he had assembled the device. Peggy had given him the materials and brought them out to his house, and he had put the device together. And subsequently took the device back to her house and gave it to her. Craig told us that he told Peggy that she should get rid of it. Seemingly, he was having second thoughts about going through with the bombing, and told her that she should take it down to the mud flats and set it off. Do not mail it.
The tracking on the package enabled investigators to identify where the package was mailed from.
The parcel containing the bomb was mailed to the Kerrs from this facility. We did not know who had sent it, whether they were from this community or whether they were from somewhere else. When I found out who mailed the bomb, I was shocked. Craig told us that Peggy was the one that mailed the bomb. The device was fairly simple in construction. It contained approximately 4 pounds of explosives, a couple of switches and some batteries, but it was very destructive. We were very concerned, inasmuch as the device traveled in the mail system. It sat in a post office for a period of time. Then they took it into their home, and it exploded once they opened it inside their home. So anywhere in transit, we could have had a disaster. The fact that David Kerr actually picked the parcel up and brought it into his home, where his wife was standing alongside him when he opened it, that was especially a sinister event.
To bring this to trial, we needed to crack the 3 siblings, and we realized the weakest link was Craig. Rather than arrest him that night, we wanted to use him as a surveillance tool. And then Craig vanishes. A number of possibilities, most of them bad, came to mind. Number one, he had done something rash. He was under such pressure that he had killed himself. More worrisome to us is that before Craig leaves and takes off, he writes a series of letters that we find at the house in a drawer. One is addressed to a postal inspector, one is to his parents, and he's basically saying, I got in this thing too deep, I didn't know when to get out. That made us even more worried that he had taken his own life. We put what we call a trap and trace procedure in motion, that if he made a phone call to his girlfriend, for example, we could trace him. And that's what happened.
And about 2 weeks later, we found that Craig was calling his girlfriend.
When we literally hear that Craig is alive, that's a tremendous sigh of relief.
We talked to her at that time and elicited her cooperation. She would let us know whenever she got a call. And then she tried to convince him to talk to one of the inspectors that he had built some rapport with.
It turned out that he left Anchorage, he flies to Seattle on a one-way ticket, and he starts hitchhiking south on I-5 to Los Angeles. She notifies us immediately. She wants him to turn himself in. There's a $10,000 reward out there.
And he agreed to do that at an appointed time, that he would call us, collect, and talk to us. We had contacted the telephone company, of course, and told them that we wanted a trap and a trace on that line.
If he made a phone call to his girlfriend, for example, she could keep him on the line for a sufficient amount of time through the telephone company, wherever that call originated from would show up.
So when the call came in, we traced that call and found that it was from a payphone in the lobby of the Roosevelt Hotel in Hollywood, California. And so we had inspectors down to Hollywood as quickly as they could while we tried to keep him on the line.
The next bit, you just couldn't make up. April 17, 1992, Los Angeles. Craig has hitchhiked all the way south to Los Angeles. He's penniless. He's destitute. He calls his girlfriend, indicating he wants to give himself up. She immediately contacts postal inspectors. Of course, we're monitoring that phone. We realized Craig was in the Los Angeles area at the Roosevelt Hotel.
Little did Craig know, but we had already traced the call and had people responding to his location.
We had a task force of 30 postal inspectors in Los Angeles on this thing.
We had an armed response team that was on their way to the Roosevelt Hotel. They had the emergency lights flashing, and as they screamed up to the hotel, it turned out at the same time there was a movie being filmed outside of the hotel. They were filming a police action movie, and our armed officers charged right through their set. It was kind of another high-five moment whenever we heard the inspector on the other end of the line telling him to put your hands up, you're under arrest.
We've got him.
That was it. He was handcuffed and apprehended. We subsequently arrested Peggy, Raymond, and Doug.
This was a big news story. It made all the papers. It was on the lead story in the news. Here we see Gustafson and Chile, who have now been in prison for some time on the Jeffrey Cain murder. Now they're paraded out by federal agents on their mail bombing charges. This headline does capture it pretty well. Bomb arrest reads like a Hollywood script. Here, this paper talks about the web of how they all work together to manufacture and orchestrate this mail bomb. We've got Doug Gustafson and Chile. We've got Craig Gustafson and Peggy.
The very fact that Peggy was very pregnant while she was manipulating blasting caps and explosives on our kitchen table with a 8-year-old child running around. It's amazing.
As a mother myself, it's hard to imagine somebody who would take such a great risk. She's got her own children's lives at risk now. Her own future is at risk. It's hard to understand how she would think that that was an appropriate or the right thing to do.
The lack of regard for other people that she had as she takes this device and puts it into the U.S. mails, where it could go off and injure or kill an employee or just an innocent bystander. And then it goes off and it kills the wrong individual.
There is a certain banality of evil in both the Kane death.
The assassination of a passing stranger out for an evening ride with his best friend, and also the death of David Kerr, the bombing of an innocent man in his own home who had zero involvement in any of this.
The decision to put a bullet into the head of an innocent passerby is as evil as anything could possibly be. And the decision to put a mail bomb into a residential community who could kill almost anyone is almost the definition of evil. The commonality of the two cases is you don't know who you're killing. You don't even know who you're killing. Could have killed a woman mother of 4 who was a post office delivery woman. Could have killed anyone.
It was a network of folks that worked on this to make this happen, which just goes to its shock value, I guess, that so many people would work so hard to cause so much damage. This is a big deal in any community, but it certainly was in Anchorage, Alaska, and to plead in mail bombing. Yeah, it was a big story.
Peggy confessed, and then Doug decided to plead guilty.
Doug Gustafson pleaded guilty to mail bomb murder in an Anchorage courtroom Thursday afternoon and accepted life in prison without parole to help save the sister he roped into a revenge plot that killed David Kerr. So I think that was part of Doug's motivation, was by pleading guilty, his sister got a lesser sentence.
That certainly was the high point in my career. Kind of hard to put this, to encapsulate one's thoughts on this after working it for as long as I did, as intensely as I did. Here's one thing I keep homing in on. The successful result was the result of evidence which was critical and creditable. It was the result of the postal inspector's perseverance and professionalism. And it was the result of the prosecutors keeping focused and keeping the pressure on to the end.
As a reporter, you want to stay neutral and you report facts and you inform the public. But as a person, you're thinking to yourself, wow, I've never seen anything like this. These were some very heinous crimes. A lot of innocent people died. And it's something that sticks with you for a long time.
It will be forever unknown how many other deaths might have ensued in some sort of spree, including, by the way, George's own. George, by raising his hand, arguably participated in a chain of events that resulted in the loss of his father and grievously wounded Michelle Kerr.
As far as I'm concerned, they took my son's life, and I used to not think of the death penalty, but to this day, I think we should implement the death penalty. But, you know, if I stay angry, I'm not going to help anybody. I'm just going to hurt myself.
In my 17 years as a journalist, it was one of the biggest cases I ever covered. And occasionally you'll run across an old article or something, and it will remind you of, oh yeah, the Gustafson-Chile case, the highway shooting, the mail bomb. It was a lot. It was a lot in Anchorage, Alaska, back in the early 90s.
Oh, it's been hard. I do have days that I just think of him constantly. I call his name And the kids laughed. Oh, well, you know, we're not Jeffrey. But that's, I miss him. There's often days when I walk in the house and I really miss Jeffrey. He's always there in my heart.